Hello, I'm Captain Pat May, the FedEx MEC Negotiating Chair. Joining me today are Captain Rich Brown and Captain Mike Westcallen of the Negotiating Committee. Welcome, guys.
Good afternoon, Pat.
Thanks. So we make up the 3 pilot members of the negotiating team, but we are supported by an experienced ALPA staff, locally and nationally. From our ALPA national staff, we have the expertise of professional negotiating attorneys, which include Andrew Shostak, the ALPA Director of Representation, and Art Luby, the ALPA Assistant Director of Representation. We've also been assisted by Kathy Powers, the ALPA Benefits Attorney and Assistant Director of Retirement and Insurance. And lastly, from ALPA National, we provided financial analysis from Liz Spear, our ALPA Lead Economic and Financial Strategist. We also consider ourselves very fortunate and lucky to have our representation attorneys, Terry McTeague and Eric Iverson, who have been with us for about 40 years combined. They have 40 years of experience that they bring to the negotiating table, defending our collective bargaining agreement. I'd be remiss to not mention the pilot volunteers and the staff from all of our committees who have been the backbone of our subject matter expertise. Yesterday, we finished in Memphis our 8th and final roadshow. We have had very positive feedback from the pilots who have joined us during the roadshow presentations. We were also asked if we could present the TA education material during a live broadcast to allow pilots who may not have time to join us in person. This is the first roadshow we've attempted, and ask for your patience for particularly maybe technical problems as we proceed throughout the day. We have a limited amount of time, briefing time, and that'll allow us to focus solely on the highlights and the areas that you have the most questions on. Therefore, if you want a deeper dive on the briefing items that we've covered during the full roadshow, please visit fdxta.com, where you'll find recordings of prior presentations. After we brief the TA highlights, we'll review the cost of a rejected TA and close out with some final comments before we take a 10-minute break. Following the break, we'll rejoin the meeting to provide you an opportunity to ask your questions regarding the material. You can begin to send in your questions at fdxqa@alpa.org. So let's get started. You have placed your trust and confidence in us for 7 years, and with your help, we've delivered. I can't tell you today, and our team can't tell you, that we've taken every penny from FedEx. What I can tell you is that we achieved your goals, and we negotiated the best deal possible, and we're proud of the work that we've accomplished. Your unified voice has delivered on the content of this historical TA. You sent a clear message to FedEx that you were dissatisfied with the pace of negotiations. Pilots have stepped up, and in the picture you see the unity. And pilots have stepped up and supported our efforts every time you were asked. Prior to the strike ballot, we were over $500 million apart. The company made an approximate $440 million move in the last days of bargaining, roughly 83% to close out the final TA. Pilots have asked, what was it that moved the needle? So let me share some of those items with you. First and foremost is that picture that you see. That's the pilots' unified voice, and they especially made certain to let the company know on that strike vote. The strike vote with 99% of the pilots voting in favor of authorizing a strike if it was necessary. And second, the company's jealously guarded global brand. It's been built over 50 years, and the company wants to maintain that global presence. The last item we believe moved us towards a TA was the mediator. During the final days of mediation, Mr. Tosi provided unambiguous direction to both parties. What Mr. Tosi told both parties in the final day was that we both needed to bring in the best we can offer, bring in the final deal to close out and to get a ratified deal to the pilots. In other words, bring in what we were able to move in the last day. The final portion of that was a half a billion dollar difference. So essentially, the company needed to move more in our direction than we needed to move in theirs. Mr. Tosi shared with us, and he was quite blunt when he stated that we needed to bring in the best deal possible to help close out the TA. In fact, we wouldn't meet in mediation again until after Labor Day following that session. But the story certainly didn't start there. It started years prior in preparation phase, when we began surveying the pilots and the MEC met to review the negotiating strategy and examine their prior contracts and lessons learned. The negotiating team and the MEC leadership believe that this TA is a historical win for the FedEx pilots and provides you and your family with long overdue improvements you've earned. When the MEC sat down a year prior to negotiations, it was in an effort to develop the opener that you have. And the MEC opener is simple and straightforward. The MEC opener says that our goal was to establish an industry-leading contract that meets our members' focused priorities of retirement, benefits, pay rates with targeted quality of life improvements. This TA achieves that goal. We achieved an industry-leading contract that's valued at $3.8 billion. Over 4 years, that's an increase of $609,000 per pilot. But let's step back for a minute before we talk about the details of the TA. In the year leading up to negotiation, a broad strategy was developed by the MEC, and the MEC decided to task us with a focused agenda. And just to remind you the focused approach, here's a quick look on the slide of what was opened by ALPA. We developed and maintained an aggressive schedule of pilot surveys. In fact, every 6 to 8 months, both online and phone surveys, a total of 11 surveys since 2018. In our latest survey in December of 22, after the company announced Drive and Network 2.0, we initiated another survey, and that was after the Delta AIP was announced. So in the focused agenda, what items were actually opened? Well, we opened 8 sections. 2 of those 8 sections are the broad economic, the large items. That's both pay rates and retirement. In other areas of the contract, we focused on targeted quality of life adjustments. There were 4 separate sections that were bargained there. 5 traveling expense, 8 deadheading, 12 hours of service, and 25 scheduling. But survey after survey showed that the pilots ranked these priorities as number 1. The priorities of retirement ranked 87% of the times it was asked, it ranked as number 1. What ranked second in those lists were retirement again, and retirement was only exceeded occasionally by pay. Beyond that were the focus or quality of life items, in particular items that pilots were being frustrated by during the pandemic operation. So survey after survey, it's been consistent with our pilots. And the results are clear. The focused negotiation has paid off. The TA took 24 months to negotiate. You can see in this slide on the purple how long our current CBA was for, 6 years. You add 24 months to that, that gives us an 8-year cycle. And the pilots understood, and that's why in the surveys the pilots identified a focused agenda. They wanted to keep the timeline as short as possible. You can simply reflect and look down the slide and see what has happened in longer duration negotiations. For example, American was over 4 years in negotiations. Now they have a tentative agreement. United Airlines pilots rescinded and re-entered negotiation 10 months ago. They just announced their AIP after 5 years in negotiations on a 3.5-year deal. Southwest Airlines, unfortunately, deep in the weeds. They have an entire rewrite approaching 3.5 years of negotiations. So what's the takeaway here for us? The takeaway was the pilots' desire to have a focused agenda worked. The pilots' desire to have a shortened negotiating cycle worked. We were able to limit the time frame of a 6-year deal to 8 years. The takeaway, our process was the correct one. The MEC made the right decision, and they strongly supported a deal that was going to be a duration of 4 or 5 years. Ultimately, the company wanted a 6-year deal when we began negotiations. We ended up with a duration of 4.5 years with 5-month early opener. That means we'll be back in negotiations in September of 2027. So let's take a look into some of the highlights of our tentative agreement. We'll start with Section 28, retirement. Mike?
Thank you, Pat. The slide you're seeing here shows the goals for Section 28 contained into our openers. During negotiations, the focus of our effort was on defined benefit plans with the goal to increase our total retirement income replacement ratio, the total defined benefit value for all pilots, while maintaining a sustainable balance between defined benefit and defined contribution plans. The result of our efforts here, the best retirement package in the airline industry. So what do our pension improvements look like under the new TA? For pilots who remain in the pension, the FAE limit increases incrementally to $325,000 at date of signing, up to a maximum of $338,000 beginning in January 2027. A new market-based cash balance plan will be established as a successor plan to the legacy pension. Pilots on the property will have a one-time choice, though, to either remain in the pension and receive the scheduled benefit increase, or transition to the market-based plan and receive a fixed increased FAA limit of $290,000 for their years of service in the pension. There is an end-of-career sick leave bonus increase from $110,000 to $150,000. And there's also a 28F LOA that provides relief for pilots who withdrew their December 31st of 2022 retirement notice, and also provides additional opportunities to retire with the bonus using provisions of a new advance notice waiver. In addition, there are also ancillary provisions that apply to the PRSP plan. So the current maximum benefit under the legacy pension is $130,000, and that's using a $260,000 high five final average earnings, or FAE limit as it's known. Again, this is a plan limit though, and not an IRS limit. Under the new TA, that FAE increases to $325,000, and that produces a maximum benefit of $162,500 for pilots retiring as of May 30th of this year until December 31st, 2024. Beginning January 1st of 2025, that limit increases again to $330,000, producing a max benefit of $165,000. And then beginning in January 1, 2027, that FAE limit increases one more time to $338,000, resulting in a maximum benefit of $169,000. Beginning January 1st of 2025, the company will establish a market-based cash balance plan. There are essentially three types of cash balance plans you should be aware of in case you're doing some of your own research. There's a fixed rate plan, a variable plan, and a market rate plan. Do not confuse the market rate based plan with the variable rate plan. There are distinct rules for each version. Like our legacy pension, the market-based plan is a defined benefit plan, but with some defined contribution features. Similar to the PRSP, the company contributes a percentage of earnings up to the IRS limit. Here the percentage is 11%. Also like the PRSP, inflation protection is built into the design. As the IRS earnings limit increases with inflation, the available contribution amount also increases. There are no years of service limits in this plan. And a lump sum benefit option is available as an alternative to the required annuity payment. Investment returns are called interest credits in this plan. They're market-based and represent the gains or losses experienced by the plan. The interest credits are applied to the plan no less than monthly. Pilots will have a choice between the two plans. Pilots already in the pension plan will have a one-time election option to move over to the market-based plan. Those pilots will receive an 11% annual contribution credit to that plan. Prior years of service in the pension, though, will freeze as of the transition date, but earnings will still accrue and are subject to an increased FAE limit of $290,000. Pilots who are hired after July 31st of 2023 will participate in the market-based plan and again receive an 11% company contribution to the market-based plan, as well as the 9% contribution to the PRSP for a total company contribution of 20%. So this slide illustrates one reason why we selected the market-based plan and not a defined contribution solution. Here to make the numbers work out easy, we're going to assume that pilot earnings are equal to or greater than the 2023 IRS earnings limit of $330,000. For this example, it's important to understand that the IRS contribution limit is calculated at 20% of the IRS earnings limit, and that happens every year. The amount is $66,000 for 2023, and this is only applicable to defined contribution plans. So the 20% that you see on the left and $66,000 are interchangeable for this discussion. So the bucket on the left, one more time, depicts the maximum annual contribution limit of $66,000 as a percentage of that IRS earnings limit. Picture also shows all the PRSP contributions available up to their individual limits. Again, the percentages are displayed off the $330,000 earnings limit. So first at the bottom, we have the company contributions of 9%. Those are required. Pilot 401k deferrals, including Ross, are above. They use a dollar limit, but are worth about 7% of the earnings limit. Sick bank overages are worth about 8% at their maximum if you are fortunate enough to have them. Alternatively, after-tax contributions to about 4% could be used. So if we do the math using sick bank contributions, if you had a full bank, we would have 9% company contributions at the bottom, 7% elected deferrals, and then 8% sick bank money. That would equal 24%, which is a 4% overage of what this limit would hold. Alternatively, if we did not have sick bank money and we applied after-tax money, we would have 9% company contributions, 7% electives, and then 4% after-tax money, again, to reach that 20% mark. The important thing to understand here is that we can reach that maximum contribution limit now. If we were to add that market-based plan, that 11%, by structuring it as a defined contribution plan, we would still get the 20% company money, but we would displace out everything else in that bucket other than that plan. So we would get 20%, but we would lose our elected deferrals and we would lose our sick bank money. By structuring the plan this way as a defined benefit plan, we leave the bandwidth available for you to make your electives, and if you're fortunate enough to have sick bank money, apply that. Using this strategy, you would have 31% available to you in total deferrals, and that number for 2023 I think would be about 102,300. Whereas if we had everything in defined contribution, you would still be limited to that $66,000 that we discussed.
Thanks, Mike. So just to summarize these retirement improvements, they're critically important. This deal improved retirement at least 30%, and the pension alone, that's 96% that comes in on the date of signing. For all pilots on property, you have a choice. Both are significantly better than what you have today. Our challenge in this environment was to raise all boats equally. In other words, we have a broad demographic of pilot. We have new hires who are as young as 24 years old and pilots getting ready to retire who are 64 years old. And it's an extremely challenging effort to try and bring all the pilots' benefits up with such a broad demographic. It's a near impossible feat. In fact, we were told it couldn't be done. Our history and the company's long-held position regarding their unwillingness to improve the legacy pension in negotiation proved it was a near impossible task. And I want to reiterate today what new pilots who've been hired in the last couple of years, what the $130,000 benefit was designed to provide you with. Initially, back in 1999, when I was hired, that pension was designed to provide us a 50% income replacement ratio. That's your retirement income divided by your annual income at retirement. So again, for pilots hired recently and with a 25-year career, your replacement ratio, if we weren't able to improve this pension, your replacement ratio today would decrease to 16% if nothing was done to improve your pension. This TA provides an almost $1.7 billion improvement in the value of our retirement benefit, which represents 44% of the total value of this TA. As a comparison, the 2015 TA added $119 million in additional value to Section 28 retirement, and in the 2006 TA, that added $75.9 million in increases of your retirement benefit. Bar none, our TA retirement offers FedEx pilots the most valuable retirement in the industry. That's ALPA and non-ALPA carriers alike. And just to add a little bit more emphasis on this item, our agreement is structured differently than Delta's, than United's, than American's deal. It's structured entirely differently. but the value is there. The numbers are clear. 30% of our value went into compensation, 30% of our value went into retirement. If you compare that to, say, Delta, for example, who had a magnificent TA as well, and now a contract, 34% of their value went into pay and fringe, and 12% went into their retirement. So let's move on into Section 3, our compensation improvements. So a couple things that occurred obviously late in negotiations as we had Section 3 compensation opened. One of those items was obviously what else was going on with other negotiations. We knew Delta was in negotiations deep into end stage. We knew United and American were also deep into end stage negotiations. So we were dealing again with a very dynamic environment. Fortunately, we started with a very high proposal on pay rates, but it also took us the better part of 6 months to close out the deal on pay. Some pilots have considered and asked questions specifically about inflation. In fact, there's a belief that our pay rates that we negotiate don't exceed inflation. We're going to step through some of those inflation charts, but I can tell you firsthand that if you measure inflation from November 21st or November of 2021, that dollar value rate should be $367 per hour. Our data signing for top of scale is $382. And if you go back and you measure that from November 15th, that inflationary adjusted dollar should be $367 again. Let's move on and look at the exact inflation chart. This first inflation chart goes back to when we had the first collectively bargained agreement back in 1999. What's notable here and what you can see is our 3 agreements. In fact, those 3 agreements that we negotiated going back to 2006, you can see where the flat line occurs. And when the flat line occurs, that shows when your pay rates have gone stale. In fact, you're in negotiations during those flat lines. What you can see is you drop below typically inflation, and typically inflation runs around 2.6 to 3%. As you project forward and you go into future negotiations, again, we had another agreement in 2011, that was the extension. But then again, the CBA that developed in 2015, you can once again see the impact of a flat line. The flat line extends by how long you're in negotiations. Let's take a closer look from the CPI numbers if we go back to the 2015 CBA. Again, in 2015, if you begin the measurement there, you can also take a look at when the 2015 CBA became amendable. And there you clearly see the crossover of the CBA current rates with inflation. And this is historic inflation that we're measured up against. And this is one of the items that we explained to the company was extremely important for us to deal with, and that was a 40-decade-old or high inflation adjustment. And the problem is the longer you go in negotiations, the harder it becomes to overcome that inflationary pressure. Clearly, based on the date of signing and the pay rates we achieved, we exceeded the inflation rates. A couple other things that we've done throughout negotiations was anytime we could identify a topic that we could negotiate and essentially put it on autopilot, that is to set it aside for future negotiations. We identified those items. Rich will talk about one of them that we identified, but clearly here with new hire pay, we were far behind an industry standard with our new hire pay, and we also identified it in ways that was similar to other contracts. We identified it as an item that we could negotiate and set aside for future bargaining if the negotiation proposals created that avenue for us. So we developed a proposal where we would change the current paradigm. That's a $4,000 a month salary. And we've moved away from that flat salary number, and we've set up this durable compensation paradigm. That will adjust with increasing pay rates from here on out. In other words, we're not going to have to go back into negotiations and ever renegotiate or expend leverage to do this. So now, new hire pilots will be paid 2.25 credit hours per day, which equates to 63 credit hours in a 4-week month and 78.75 credit hours in a 5-week bid month. For example, on this slide, you can see a new hire narrow-body first officer at the end of this agreement will have a pay rate of $105.09, multiplied by 63 credit hours in a 4-week bid month. They'll be compensated $6,620 for that month. And you can also see the impact if you go to and view the wide-body first officer. On the bottom right, you can see that we've increased our new hire pay by 114%. So let's move on to look at the negotiated 2000 TA pay rates. What was notable and important to us here was that we actually achieved 5 pay raises in just 3.5 years. Again, 5 pay raises for just 3.5 years. Important again was the data signing, but after the data signing and just 6 months later, we go from 14% to 3%. In other words, 17.1% compounded. 12 months later, at DOS plus 18, we're at 22.1% compounded. 12 months later, 25.7, and 42 months later, 29.6% compounded pay raises. That's over $100,000 more per year in the wide-body captain seat. But one thing is important to realize that through the focused negotiation, we also realized, and the MEC realized, that many items would be left out of this negotiation. Important items for pilots, such as Section 11 pay rates or Section 11 overrides. So what you need to recognize is as you look at the pay rates here, it has broad implications throughout the contract, anywhere there's a credit hour component. Just to give you an example, draft pay, volunteer pay, FAR extension pay, disruptions and overages are all impacted by these new pay rates. We've also provided some comparisons which are available online, but today we'll run through a few of those with you. It was important, and it was brought up to our attention during the first roadshow. A pilot wanted to see what all the underlying assumptions were to build the compensation charts. So what we've done is outlined here for you what those underlying assumptions are. But notable among these are the 777, and the 777 is paid on average 93 credit hours per month. It's higher than the rest of our wide-body fleet, in fact, our entire fleet. That's 1,116 hours, and that's based off a 20% differential and improvement over the 76 and other aircraft. The 777 has a 6.48 credit hour per day calculation. That's not based off of working more days, that's working the same amount of days, but a higher credit based off of their bid pack. In other words, what things are in the 777 bid pack in terms of how the lines are built, plus things like block over 8, block over 10. What you see on the other fleets types throughout the compensation charts is a 5.4 credit hour day for everybody. The only exception to this would be when we look at and we compare ourselves to UPS. So when we're comparing these other numbers, we'll show you 936 credit hours, and that's based off of their contractual average line values in their PBS system. Our non-PBS system, based off of our targets in our bid packs, are 4-week and 5-week, 72 and 90 hours respectively. So that average is 936 average hours per year. So it makes a pretty good apples for apples comparison. Another thing you'll see on the compensation charts as I click through them will be the vacation compensation. The vacation compensation is simply based on the highest accrual and value for the effective date. So it's our maximum value credit, which is 216 hours. What you'll also notice is that we've maximized or showed the maximum value of credit for each one of the other airlines, including UPS, Delta, American, and United. The retirement compensation are based on the company contributions for both your defined contribution plan and a market-based cash balance plan. So that's 9% in the DC bucket that Mike talked about and 11% in the market-based cash balance plan. Again, this is just company money. None of your own contributions are included in this. And that goes up to the IRS limit. The IRS limit this year is $330,000. So as you look at the compensation charts, when you look online, you'll see a DOS plus 42. Our actuaries adjusted the current IRS limits for standard inflation rates. So you'll see IRS compensation value or IRS limits at $365,000 when you look at DOS plus 42. So let's take a look at some of the charts. We have 85% of our pilots in our wide-body pay band. In this chart, you see just the 777. This is just the 777 top rate for captains at date of signing. What you see here on the compensation side is a little over $425,000. So that comparison includes the 20% premium. In the green box above that the compensation is the value of vacation. The value of vacation is not what you have to sell back to earn it. That's the value that we negotiated in the contract. It's the best vacation in the industry, and we improved it this time around. That vacation calculation is calculated again at 216 credit hours times the data signing pay rate, which is $382.53. And again, if you look at the top gray box, that's the accounting method behind our combined DC 9% and 11% market-based cash balance plan. That's 20% total. So if you multiply 20% times $330,000, you end up with $66,000. So what's the challenge here on the pay banding side? The pay banding, when you're comparing specific rates, we only have a 2 pay banded rate system. Narrow body, and our narrow bodies are a 7.5, and we also include a 7.3 pay rate in that band. Our wide body pay band includes Airbus 767, MD-11, and 777. So the challenge when walking in is we don't compare equally to anybody else when we're simply comparing those pay bands. As you know, UPS has a single pay band for all their fleet types, and all the other airlines typically have multiple narrow body bands and usually 2 or 3 wide body bands. So when you look at our actual pay rate that was established there, typically if you take the top 2 wide body rates of each of the airlines who now have a TA or an agreement, a new agreement such as Delta, and you average those, you're going to be within dollars of what our average is for our wide body rates. Moving over to the top of comparison for 767 top rate, what you see again here is our 767, which is a 300, compared to the UPS single pay rate, also compared to the Delta 767 300, same equipment for same equipment. We recognize that the Delta pilots were able to negotiate higher rates on their 767 400. And so what does that mean for the Delta pilots? Well, the Delta pilots in their A350, for example, they had 3% in that very top band. Once they included their 767 400 in that band, through their successful negotiation, they were able to increase in their top pay band, and they have about 20% of their pilots into that top pay band. But it takes them approximately 23 years or so to get into that top pay band, whereas we have 85% of our pilots in the wide body pay band, and our pilots can get to the wide body pay chart sooner in their career. In fact, now with the new pay scheme, pilots will max out the top of scale in the wide body airplane at 12 years. Moving on to the DOS earnings comparison for narrow body top rate captains, again, you'll see some slight differences here. Our TA for narrow body includes 757 and 737s. UPS, again, is a single pay scale, and based on their TA information, that's based off of 85 credit hours per month. We've included the Delta 757, 767 rate, as well as American. What was notable here was we could have easily compared us against the Delta 73 rate, the American 73 rate, and all other smaller equipment. But rather than do that, we chose to go to the higher pay scale that they have established for their blended rate, the 75, 76 rates. So we did a couple things late in negotiation to deal with the historical changes that FedEx presented to us during the last 6 months of negotiation. Those notable things obviously was a historic restructure, basically integrating Ground with Express. The company has identified through Drive and Network 2.0 essentially $4 billion worth of savings from now until fiscal year 25. We also understand that senior executives at FedEx have put out communications to their employees and to the broader financial markets that have caused concerns among the pilots. We take those concerns seriously. We brought the concerns internally back to the MEC and had significant discussions about pulling out or pulling back Section 1 TA. That's regressive bargaining. And if we were to make that stand and pull a section that was TA'd back off the table that was already TA'd, we certainly could expect FedEx to react in kind, and in fact, perhaps more severely with sections that we had already TA'd. Internally, the MEC discussed the options at hand. We presented some options that would have a greater impact and more immediate impact on the career progression concerns that pilots were now faced with. Let's face it, pilots came here from perhaps Delta, United, or other major carriers, or perhaps turned down job offers. Pilots that came here and were hired during the pandemic made these decisions. That career progression scale or that model has not held up. In fact, the only evidence we need to look to is System Bid 2301, and we can see a backward slide with our normal career progression. So it was decided that rather than cause harm to the negotiating cycle and be regressive in bargaining, that we would take two proactive measures. One was to provide negotiation opener, a proposal on 28F letter that Mike briefed you on. That 28F letter is designed to pull more pilots off the top, incentivize retirements in a quicker fashion than what the normal ordinary contract does under 28F. 28F requires a 1-year notice to get the signing bonus. What we did is reduce that ability and eliminated that as an obstacle. The other item that we did is we directly impacted all the pilots who have been hired from essentially 2009 and beyond. So really every pilot from our last negotiation, 2015 forward, we made a focused approach, and the focused approach was to accelerate our long bargained and historical 15-year top of scale. That goes back to 1999, 15-year top of scale pay rate, and we accelerated those pay scales to 12 years. And we do it in just 18 months from the date of signing. 18 months, and we are at an industry standard 12-year of service top of scale pay. And the impact on pay rates are significant and they're real. So if you look, for example, at the wide body captain pay on the left side, that's 8 years of service. That wide body captain will receive a 38.3% compounded increase. And you can see the impact on each one of these seats. Wide body first officer has a compounded increase from DOS to DOS plus 42 of 46.1%. The narrow body captain, 39.2, and finally the narrow body first officer has a nearly 50% increase in their pay due to the acceleration from 15 to 12 years of scale. Now granted, you may be outside of the window. In other words, you may only have been here at FedEx for a year or two, but this will impact your career if this TA is ratified. If TA is ratified, this will be in place. And look, FedEx did not welcome this addition late in the game. But we put the blame at their feet. We put the blame and said that they caused the concerns, was not introduced by anything we did at the table. Even though this was not in our opener, we felt it was necessary and important to offset the career progression scale that pilots had looked at. So let's move on to Section 1, scope. Rich?
Thanks, Pat. You know, we've done this several times now in person, and this is the first time we've done it virtually, but I still ask myself the same question every time. I mean, we start this briefing and Mike gets to talk about retirement, Pat gets to talk about pay, and I get to talk about scope. So with that, let's try to get into what we got going here. Scope is about job protections. So when the company came in and they wanted to talk about scope, we obviously took a hard look at what's in scope for us as far as job protections and what the company wanted. And what the company was after was basically a reduction in the wet lease penalties and more flexibility in the ability to use penalty-free wet lease. Now, why did they want this? Well, we took a deep dive into what actually those penalties cost the company and what the percentage of cost in a wet lease comes from that penalty payment. And in the end, that penalty payment is nothing more than a tax on the overall cost. The wet leasing out there is 2 times as expensive as flying our own planes with our own pilots, and it's 15 to 20% less reliable. So that penalty payment really wasn't doing what it was supposed to be doing. It wasn't a true deterrent to the company wet leasing. So what we tried to do was actually put real job protections into Section 1, and we were successful in this. In the end, even though it was a section the company opened, we were able to create a stronger, more protective Section 1 for our pilots. It's an improvement over what we currently have. The first improvement is putting a real restriction on wet leasing into the contract. The restriction is on new, extended, or renewed wet leases during 4A2C. Well, why did we do this? Well, we have some really good protections in our contract. Section 23 furlough talks about the fact that the company has to go through 4A2B and 4A2C before they can furlough. And 4A2B and 4A2C have some very strong protections for us as well. So we connected the wet leasing to those strong protections that we already have in our contract. Why did we allow a penalty in furlough instead of keeping the prohibition? Well, we had a discussion with the company. The company's position is that they can maintain 482C into furlough, but they can maintain 482C into furlough. But then as the flying comes back, hockey stick recovery would actually make it so they might not have enough people on property to fly the new business that they're getting or could get. So we wanted to allow them the ability to gain that new business so we would have flying for our pilots to come back to and possibly even bring our pilots back faster. But we maintained a penalty on that flying since the company should have had our pilots flying those block hours. And that penalty is paid directly back to the pilots that should have been doing that flying. What else did we do in scope? Well, the penalty payments that the company wanted, one of the reasons they wanted it is because of the complexity in our current language. We've had a lot of discussions up to now about how complex that language is, and there's been a lot of misreading of that language. Well, they wanted a little simplification, and we agreed. So we simplified the penalty payments to be based on the block hours flown by our trunk aircraft in the previous year and the net aircraft with an adjustment for net aircraft additions. The company can't manipulate last year's data. Under the current structure, there was a little manipulation that the company could do. So we've made the payments easier to calculate and more transparent. And the last piece is that we made it so the company actually had to make those payments. In the past, they didn't have to pay for the wet leasing until the contracts were over. So a long-term contract or a delay in the end of a contract meant that the payment was delayed as well. The new payment is required to be paid in the first quarter of every fiscal year. And the last piece was on Section 1B9. Why is this important? Well, 1B9 is about the reporting requirements for the company on wet leasing activities, including now our belly freight activities. Code sharing, interline freight, stuff like that is all in 1B4. The company in the past has been good about answering our questions regarding individual instances of 1B4 freight. However, it wasn't codified in the contract. There was no reason that they had to answer those questions. So what we were able to do is get that codified in the contract. This is important because if we decide that next time around we want to attack scope as a pillar of our negotiation, we need to have the proper information to actually create a solution for scope that fills our needs, that doesn't prevent the company from doing the things we want them to do, but prevents them from doing the things that we don't. Because wet leasing and 1B4 freight in the past have actually brought business and brought flying to our pilots. Two recent examples are Johannesburg and Nairobi. So using this new language, we can actually go out and build a database of information on this 1B4 flying to see where it's actually going and what they're doing with it, so we can actually craft a real solution for scope in the next negotiation. Quality of life items. Our overarching theme in quality of life was twofold. First, we wanted to maintain pilots' ability to control their schedules and maintain their seniority. And second, we wanted to put in some fatigue mitigation measures. So how did we do that? Well, starting in Section 25, we started with the SAM definition. This doesn't really fit under either of those two categories. Where this really fits is more in the scope decision, or is the scope discussion. But the SAM previous definition was the average of all the regular lines and the secondary lines. We changed that to be the weighted average of all the average BLGs in the bid packs. Now, why did we do that? Secondary lines are all over the place in terms of value, because we can do different things with our secondary lines in terms of including carry-in in our BLG or not including carry-in. So the secondary line values can be as low as single digits, 9 hours or 16 hours. And those low values were dragging down the SAM. So even before this particular situation in time that we're facing right now, the scheduling committee came to us before we were even into negotiations and said, we'd like to change this because we don't think that these secondary lines are good for us as far as the SAM goes. And we were able to do that. Now, what is the weighted average of average BLGs? All that means is it takes into account the number of lines in each bid pack. So as you take that average BLG and multiply it by the number of lines, what you end up with mathematically is the same thing as an average of all the bid pack lines. And that new SAM definition increases the value of the SAM by 2 to 2.5 hours. which helps to keep us out of 4A2B and 4A2C. We did work with the company on student lines. The company wanted training lines. They wanted to just take lines. We worked back and forth with them, and we came up with a solution that provided a new scheduling tool for pilots at a premium of 125%. We think that pilots will enjoy the ability to clear a schedule or to work a partial month or to just work for more money in that month, and that this gain is a good counterpoint to the fact that we have given up some measure of our ability to get paid to stay at home on training bumps. Another ancillary part of this solution was that the monthly bidding timelines, including the closing of the captain's bid, are earlier, including the release of the secondary lines. So the secondary lines will be published more than a day earlier for captains, and actually 5 hours earlier for the first officers as well. In the view add window, the company wanted to force pilots to fly or to add to their lines to make sure they were min-bid period guarantee, even in the view add window. So they didn't want to allow you to not fly up to min-bid period guarantee. They were going to fill up your line mandatory. We didn't allow that, but we did allow for a procedure where you can elect to have your line built up in the view add window. Why would someone want to do this? If you're a junior guy, you don't know how far down the list you are, and you want to have a full month. Right now, you have to basically put in all the trips in open time to make sure that you get enough to fill up your line. This is just an option that would allow pilots to avoid that situation and say, I would like you to build up my line. I would like you to use this kind of trips. The only thing you have to remember if you do that is that if you elect to have your line built up, the company will do it if there are trips available, regardless of if they meet your requirements or not. They will do your requirements first. If they can't fill it up with that, then they will fill it up with other things. Pilots may now trade a block of our days with another pilot's trip or trips. It used to be that you could trade a block of our days for a trip, but in a lot of cases, pilots wanted to trade a week of hub turns for a block of our days, and that was not possible under the current CBA. So in the TA, we've now allowed you to trade that block of our days for that series of trips. And the last piece of this is creating a true long-haul reserve. And this was part of our hotel standby solution. We originally were trying to get rid of hotel standbys. We have a new solution for that we feel is a very strong solution. And part of that solution was creating R16 lines, which are true long-haul reserve, since the company can't just create a hotel standby to fill that R16 and make you come into base instead of sitting at home on your reserve period. Next thing we were able to accomplish in Section 25 is first fly preferencing. Currently, we have the ability to select first fly, but it's a blunt tool. All it allows you to do is say, I would like to fly, or I don't want to fly, and then you get whatever the company gives you. Well, this will allow you to put in a first fly request with conditions, similar to a makeup request, where you can request a specific trip, or you can make a request with conditions on it. I only want to go to the West Coast. I would like a back-end deadhead. And then the company will go through and if the trip is less than 60 hours time away from base, those first fly preferences will be awarded in seniority order. So you'll have an opportunity to get the trip you want out of open time instead of just getting whatever they decide to give you. Now, if those trips are longer than 60 hours time away from base, then the company still has the ability to use a best fit, but your first fly preferences will be given a priority. There's a new draft system in the TA, and it's a text-based system. And the idea here is that you will opt into this system with a phone number that you supply to the company. When a draft trip becomes available, the company will send out a mass text. And then anybody that wishes to participate or wishes to have that draft trip will then text an answer back to the company. There's two buckets for this system. The first bucket is for all those trips that are more than 4 hours from showtime. In that case, the company will leave open the window for 15 minutes and then lock in the people that have replied over those 15 minutes. They'll take those pilots and look back 6 months and award the draft trip to the pilot who has the least draft hours in the previous 6 months. If two pilots are tied as far as draft hours, then the more senior pilot will get the trip. If the showtime for the trip is less than 4 hours from when the draft text goes out, then it will be first come, first serve, fastest finger. Whoever replies first gets the trip. Another thing we were able to do in Section 25, and this also kind of ties into Section 4 as well, but was we were able to increase and improve and actually add some new disruptions. First thing we were able to do is with landing disruptions. The first landing used to be 30 minutes. We've increased that to an hour and a half so that every landing is now an hour and a half. We were also able to add a new duty period disruption for deadheads removed at the front of a trip. It's the same rules as for deadheads removed at the back end of a trip. So now you will get compensated if you had that front end deadhead and then you have to come to Memphis to start anyway. We were able to improve the layover disruption. Currently, it's 50% or greater, receives an hour and a half of pay. What we were able to do is change that to 50, or currently it's greater than 50% is an hour and a half of pay. We were able to change that to 50% or greater is 3 credit hours. Why does that 50% or greater really matter? Well, it actually increases the number of times this disruption hits by 4, and it increases the amount it costs the company 3 times. The second part of this is a 75% line that basically is just a nod for those trips that get totally changed. And if you cross that 75% or more line, then you get 4 credit hours. It's one or the other. It's not both. It's either 3 or 4. It's not cumulative. The last disruption we were able to create is a new data critical disruption. And this is for trips that have more than half of their duty periods in the day that get changed to more than half of their duty periods touching the critical duty period. And in that case, you will receive an hour and a half of credit. Section 4 is kind of attached to 25 in some ways. We didn't open this, but there were some things that we were able to accomplish here because the company opened this. The first one is pay for maintaining currency, is now based on an objective formula. The company had been using kind of arbitrary rules that depended on which system chief or which chief pilot was doing your training. What we were able to accomplish is a system that's based on the last time that you did a landing currency training simulator. AVA, the company wanted to change all of our draft, volunteer, and AVA so that you had to fly to mid-bid period guarantee before you got any premium. We were able to convince them that that was not in their best interest, and they left draft and volunteer the same as it is in the current CBA. It's 150% for the first hour to the last, and it doesn't matter what else you fly for draft and volunteer. AVA, we were able to develop a system where if you can work the system and fly your mid-bid period guarantee and be awarded a mid-bid period guarantee line, then you will be paid 175% for all of your AVA hours. There's a flow chart on the FDX TA website under the FAQs if you want to dive deeper into what exactly you get paid for different combinations on AVA. But the important thing to remember is if this works for you, you can get paid 175% for all of those AVA hours. Section 5, traveling expenses. Pat mentioned that we tried to fix things so they stayed fixed going forward. The per diem was one area where we tried to do that. We tried to have a CPI adjustment annually. We were unable to accomplish that, but we were able to increase our per diem rates to $265 and $365 for domestic and international at data signing. In June of 2025, those numbers go up to $285 and $385. That $265 number is kind of interesting because we initially had a higher number in there, but the company came to us and said, look, the maximum IRS allowed tax-free amount for most of the places that we go in the United States is 64 hours. 265 gives you 63 and change. So if we were to go higher than 265, we would just be generating extra taxable income, which kind of defeats the purpose of putting that money in per diem. So we agreed to the 265 at data signing and then increased it to 285 in June of 2025. Expense reports have been another big problem in the last few years. We were able to improve the notice that pilots get regarding missing or incomplete receipts. And the way this system works is basically a system of notifications that will tell you not only that you're missing a receipt, but which receipt, how much it's for, and when it needs to be put in. And then there will be a series of 3 different warnings before there's a payroll deduction. And these warnings are not related to when the expense report closed or the receipt deadlines. They're totally related to when they notify you. So this should reduce or eliminate the likelihood of payroll deductions for things that the company should pay for. We were also able to accomplish the removal of a requirement for a hotel folio or receipt for your expense reports. We feel like, especially in the COVID environment where we had so many non-contract hotels and so many receipts, that this just made sense. They know which hotel you're at. They made the reservation. They know you were there. So why do we need to give them a folio? Well, they still require a folio, so the language reads kind of funny. The language says that the company will provide you with a way to allow the hotel to provide the company with a folio, and that's about your own information security. That's to allow you to control which folio goes to the company, so we don't end up with a situation where your personal folio for incidentals gets sent to the company. Vacation. We removed the 40% limitation on vacation buyback. Some people say that is a manning issue or a staffing issue. Our view on that is that there's no reason that a pilot should ever lose any or forfeit any vacation hours to the company. And there were situations in the past where, especially junior pilots, they got to the end and maybe they couldn't use quite enough of their vacation and they end up forfeiting the amount over 40%. We never wanted that to happen again. Added to that, this is your money. Remember we talked about at the outset that we wanted to maintain pilot choice and pilot control. Well, this is your money. You should be able to use it how you want, and you can control your schedule however you want and not forfeit your vacation bank. The other thing the company wanted here was to require flying. Well, initially they wanted to get rid of the 24 credit hour penalty for a vacation cancellation, a voluntary vacation cancellation. We were able to get them to a minimum bid period guarantee or you have to fly a minimum bid period guarantee before you get that 24 credit hours. And we were willing to do that because we looked at the data, and the data told us that this is something that pilots don't generally do. It was 10% of our 10% of the instances where vacation was sold back that were where a pilot flew less than mid-bid period guarantee. And only 7% where they were more than 6 hours from mid-bid period guarantee. In fact, our pilots typically fly a lot more when they sell back vacation, to the tune of an average of 85 credit hours in a 4-week bid month or 109 credit hours in a 5-week bid month. So we thought that this was a good trade we could make in exchange for fixing some of the problems we saw with involuntary vacation cancellation, which is obviously the worst case scenario. Weddings, vacations, all kinds of things can be in your month that you bid for that vacation and you planned around that vacation. So for the company to be able to come and take that away, we didn't feel like that same 24-hour penalty was enough, and we didn't feel like there were enough places where the company was trying to avoid doing that. So what we were able to do is require the company to at least ask twice for voluntary cancellations before they can even consider that involuntary cancellation. As a matter of fact, while we were in negotiations, this situation happened. The company was going to make an involuntary cancellation, and we asked them to make another ask at voluntary cancellations, and they were able to get enough voluntary cancellations. So we codified that in the contract that they have to ask at least twice. Another thing that we did is there's nothing in the contract right now that says that involuntary vacation cancellations have to be in reverse seniority order. We were able to codify that so that we make sure that seniority is honored if it comes to a situation where this has to happen. And the last piece to the fix was we were able to increase the 24 credit hour penalty to a 36 credit hour penalty. And that 36 credit hour penalty is yours whether or not you fly any during that month. For deadheading, we tried to capture some of the things from the travel MOU. The two big ones were the deviation bank and the rental cars. We were able to get some traction on both issues. For the deviation bank, we were able to get 100% of your deviation bank retained for 3 bid months, and then the 4th bid month, that amount will be cut by 50%, and in the 5th bid month, it will go to 0. Currently, in the current CBA, your bank is cut in half each month. And if you do the math on that, by the 5th month in the current plan, if you had it started with $1,000, you would only have $31.25 left. So what we've done here is put more money for longer in pilot's control as they manage their own deviation banks. Seat selection fees. This is an area that has been complicated by the positioning sequence versus the flight segment, the $40 and $80 limits, and a lot of people get burned on this. We basically eliminated all of that. It's all just the positioning sequence, and we increased the amount to $100. I said we tried to retain rental cars from the travel MOU. We were able to do that, so pilots can still use that. That was a very popular addition in the travel MOU, and so pilots will retain the ability to use rental cars as a deviation expense. Hotel use over the sub window. This is something for guys that live out of town, don't have a crash pad, and get a sub and want to stay in town for their sub window. They are now able to use or get a hotel as an allowable reimbursable expense. It's all the same rules, so it's still the contract rate. You'll have to get the hotel yourself, but you can use your deviation bank or your hotel bank to pay for that hotel in the sub window. And the last piece was a receipts not required for an expense report that's less than, or the receipts not required for less than $75 on your expense report. That limit used to be $25. This is part of the overall thing with expense reports where we've eliminated the hotel folio, we've eliminated receipts for less than $75, and we've improved the system for giving you warnings before you get a payroll deduction and the information that you get so you can find the proper receipt to turn in. Section 12, this is where we worked on fatigue issues, and the first one is really on fatigue calls. The current system has you called in well after a fatigue call at the end of your trip. It sounds okay until you think about it in terms of a week of hub turns. So say you're in Phoenix and you call in sick, but your next trip starts in Memphis the next afternoon going back to Phoenix. So you have to get your rest, but then you have to figure out a way to get back to Memphis for your next trip. What was happening is pilots were typically having to jump seat back to Memphis on the flight that they were going to operate, which isn't a real great fatigue mitigation. So what we were able to do is say that you don't get your automatic well call until 24 hours after your fatigue call. And what that does is it basically knocks out that next day's trip. So you get a whole day to recover and then get back to Memphis for that next day's trip. There are a lot of changes in minimum layovers and scheduled and operational. Basically what we've done is we've matched up our scheduled rest provisions to 117. You can see them written here, but the main things to look at are scheduled went from 9 hours to 9.5. 117 is 10 hours, but that's block to block. Our 9.5 goes from 30 minutes after block in, so that's how we line that up with 117. And then if you have a followed deadhead only duty period, it increased from 8 hours to 8.5, so half an hour on each one of those. The operational improvements were even better. Operationally, your rest is increased from 8 to 9 hours to actually provide you an opportunity to get 8 hours of rest. And the duty period with a deadhead only is still that 8.5 from 8, so it was only increased by half an hour. 8 and 24, we increased the domestic block hour limitations, and those are basically the same. They match up to the others as far as increasing the schedule from 9 to 9.5 and the minimum from 8 to 9. The one additional improvement we got here is that there was a holdover from when we were, before we became a flag operator, of rest of minimum FAR limitations. And under the old rules, that was 16 hours, but flag rules are only 8. And that never got fixed after we came to flag rules, so we were able to get that increased to 11 hours to match other parts of Section 12. Mediation LOA, this created a mediation process in our contract that didn't exist before, provides for a neutral mediator up to 12 cases a year. There's a podcast on the FDX TA website that goes into this in detail, and if you're interested in this mediation LOA, then I highly encourage you to go and listen to that podcast. Section 26, this is another section that we didn't open, but we did very well in. We were able to update and improve the definition of flight data. The old definition, or the definition of the current CBA, is from 1999. I think we all know that there's been a lot of improvements in the amount of data that's coming off our airplanes since 1999, and we were able to capture all of that data under a new flight data definition. About the only thing coming off the airplane that's not included is an ACARS message. And then we took that flight data definition and we improved the protections. Current CBA just has protection against discipline. The new TA has protections against any actions as far as medical, training, or discipline. So we improved the protections and improved the amount of information that's included in that flight data definition. Another big improvement we got was a new prohibition against video recordings or still images of a pilot. This obviously is an initiative in ALPA. There's several reasons that this is important over and above the obvious one that we just don't want a camera focused on us the whole time we're flying. And they have to do with less than fully manned cockpits. For single-person cockpits, they often require, or they do require, a camera in the cockpit somewhere to monitor both the instruments and the pilot. This would not allow that kind of a situation. The other piece of this is that fully unmanned cockpits require usually some information about how we actually do our jobs. And they get this information in part from videotaping how pilots actually do our jobs. So this is a protection against against those less than fully manned cockpits as well. So we were proud that we got this put into the contract. The company asked for electronic CBAs. I think that's the way most people are doing it anyway. If you want a paper copy, you'll be able to get a paper copy through some kind of an FCIF that the company will put out that you can respond to get a paper copy. And the last thing in here is the passports. Currently, you only have to have it 30 days prior, but for many countries out there, they require 6 months left on your passport to be able to enter the country. So we thought this was a good addition because it gives pilots warning before they would actually have a problem. So you're required to have that passport 210 days before it runs out to make sure that you can get into any country that you might need to get into. Pat mentioned duration earlier. The company started out at 6 years. We started out at 4. We did see some ability to capture more value in a 5-year contract in terms of pay rates, but through the surveys and through the MEC's input, we decided that the shorter contract was better, and we were able to negotiate that down to a 4.5-year deal with, as Pat said, a 5-month early opener. So we'll be able to be back in contract negotiations 4 years and 1 month after date of signing. And those dates will be, as they're listed up here, July 31st of this year, the first day of the August bid month will be the signing date. The amendable date is the first day of the February 2028 bid period. And then our openers would be on September 2nd of 2027. There's several LOAs that are attached to the deal. There's a transition LOA that has to do with the retirement. What I'd like to talk about here is more the implementation LOA. And it has 4 phases in it. DOS, Phase 2 is the first day of December of 2023. Phase 3 is the first day of August in 2024. And Phase 4 is the first day of November in 2024. There are no TBDs in this deal. Everything that we have improved in this contract will be put into place by the 1st of November in 2024. The amendable period recovery payments, we've structured it this time a little bit differently, and the reason for that is so that we can get that whole payment to you in one lump sum as opposed to the several tranches that we've had in the past. So the amendable period that it's working on is November 2nd of 2021 through July 30th of this year. And the way it will work is it looks at active pilots. You have to be active for 1 day in a bid month to get this value, or a captain for 1 day to get the captain's value. So for each day that you are an active captain, or each month that you have 1 day as an active captain, you will get $1,450. For each day as an active first officer, you'll get $950. So if you were a captain the entire time, your max payment would be $30,450. The max for an FO would be $19,950. This will be paid in cash, and it is pensionable and eligible for PRSP contributions. It will be distributed no later than October 15th of 2023. Some people talk about recovery payments and they say this isn't enough because it's not enough to prevent the company from stalling. The truth about any kind of a retro payment is it's never enough to prevent a company from stalling. Time value of money says that the company is always better off paying the money later than paying the money now, even if they pay the same amount. And the time from which the pay rates went stale does matter. So people complain about the fact that this this amenable period recovery payment is not as large as some of the other properties that are getting retro payments right now. But our pay rates went stale 21 months ago versus other properties where it's 36 to 4 years to 5 years since they've had their last raise. And although it does compensate us for that time, very rarely do any of these retro payments, and none of the ones that are out there right now, capture all of the value that's lost by missing out on pay rates. It's just a negotiated number. We feel that any increase in pay that is forward-looking and continues forever is way more important than any increase in the amount of the amenable period recovery payment. So that's kind of how we balance these things out when we were negotiating. And then if you take a look at what other properties did get in their amenable recovery payments, Delta's $700 million, the biggest retro payment that an ALPA carrier has ever had. If you figure out that's 36 months, so if you divide by 36 months, then you divide by their 15,000 pilots, that comes out to $1,296 a month. And that money is not pensionable. United's deal is $1,250 a month. Now, some of that money is pensionable. We were unable to tease out that amount on that, but it's $1,250 plus some amount of pensionable money. If you figure out the average on hours, $1,450 for a captain, $950 for a first officer, the average is $1,200 a month. If you add in the pensionable amount, it's $1,309 a month. So we're all right in the same ballpark as far as these retro payments. Now, ours is structured a little bit differently because we spread our money out over captains and first officers, unlike the other properties where it was based on how much money you made. So the rich got a lot richer and the people that weren't making that much didn't get as much. We didn't feel like that was the best method for our property. We felt like spreading the money out among all of our pilots was a better idea. So that's why our payments are what they are. Pat?
Thanks, Rich. So what we're going to do next is talk briefly through what does a rejected TA look like. And why do we talk about this? Well, first and foremost, it's our responsibility. Just as we do as professional aviators, we always assess risk every time we fly. The most important aspect in that is to identify the correct risk and avoid the over-focus on distractions. Some pilots right now may be fixated on the wrong risks. Some have identified even a wet lease scenario of a new business model just to furlough pilots. Makes no business sense. And now there's also a discussion, or at least questions, about a target identified with a pension risk transfer retirees. I think we've received those questions and answered them sufficiently. The current risk for pilots right now are the low volumes and overstaffing situation, and now a potential change, a regulatory change of mandatory retirement age, which would further overstress or over-aggravate our overstaffing. So here's why this is a problem if the TA fails. First, we have a return to the table because we're in mediation. We have a third party. We can't just decide to meet on our own with the company and reestablish negotiations. We first have to have a conference with the appropriate stakeholders, negotiating committee, with the National Mediation Board members. We have an unknown timeline for that process, but what would first be required is that meeting. We don't know how long that'll take. Secondly, is there a divergence in surveys? Is there a divergence in priorities among pilots? The only way to get to an answer there is to actually resurvey the pilots under this new paradigm of a failed TA. And I can assure you an 87% formidable number one issue of retirement is not going to sink to the bottom. It will still be a priority of many of the pilots. So what about the amendable period recovery payment that Rich just spoke to you about? What happens with that? Well, I can assure you the company will view that as our problem, not theirs. They'll say they negotiated in good faith, and they did. We negotiated in good faith, but the pilots didn't ratify the deal. So who pays for the further delay in the contract? The company will absolutely stake some ground that that delay is owned by ALPA. We, of course, would fight that. So what about the specific economic impact? Well, we know for a fact, and it's calculable, we could potentially be sacrificing over $70 million in pay and benefits and increased value. That's $39.3 million in wages and $31.3 million in retirement. So we know also that a new hire would lose approximately $340,000 in future retirement benefits if that new hire moves over to the market-based cash balance plan. That more than doubles if the pilot's been here or if the delay is longer than 2 years. So as the data shows here, we have real and identified current risk, which is low volumes and overstaffing. This is just the fact of the reality of today's environment. We also know is that our estimates, which are confirmed by the ALPA SIG PSIT team, that we're 700 to 800 pilots overstaffed. This creates for a high likelihood of entry into 4A2B and 4A2C, which allows for those reduced BLGs to mitigate or to come across to the pilots in real pay implications. So under a rejected TA, what issues should you be aware of? Well, you can see on the slide, on the left side of the slide, it's a rejected TA scenario. On the right side is a ratified TA. So first, our TA language, which improves the definition in our favor of a system-wide average metric, or SAM, which is currently the book. Well, we would certainly revert back to the current book language. We would never achieve the TA improved language. And we know for a fact that our new language actually improves those credit hours to the tune of 2 to 2.5 hours. In other words, we would move 2 to 2.5 hours closer in entry into 4A2B and 4A2C. In fact, if the synthetic buildup that the company is doing today were removed, we would be in 4A2B. So this is extremely important in light of the current CBA pay rates and what they would be increased to under the new TA. The new TA pay rates essentially neutralizes the pay reduction we would face under reduced BLG under 4A2C. So in either instance, we're far better off under the new contract, under the new data signing pay rates. Secondly, you would see that we would lose the newly negotiated language and protections with Section 1 that Rich briefed you on, which puts real limits in place for the company to wet lease during 4A2C. In a worst-case scenario, furloughs. We would also lose that new language and revert to no penalty payment targeted for the furloughed pilot. Ultimately, the point here is we would much rather have the new TA pay rates, the new SAM definition, and the wet lease and furlough protections in the agreement. So when I mentioned the SIG PSIT, the union chairman for that, Marty Harrington, his group has published their SIG notes. And in the SIG notes, they have identified clearly a declining value of the SAM. And you can see from this chart, and you go back to 4A2B, and those of you who were here in April timeframe of 2009, we got to experience the reduced bid line guarantees under 4A2B, back then 48 and 60 credit hours, in particular on the 757 and Airbus fleet. So we all suffered through the 4A2B. Well, under the new, or under the current system-wide average metric, you can see we're clearly below the red line once again, dangerously below it. There's been a slight uptick where the PSIT has reflected a recent uptick for the June bid month. But we are also well below the red line. The purple line is simply the average of the block hours per non-pay-only pilot. If we included the pay-only pilots, that's typically the line check airmen, standard check airmen, these hours actually get worse. So the only thing really at this point in time keeping us away from or out of 4A2B or 4A2C even has to do with the company's addition of reserve lines and building up the current pay on the current lines. So what ultimately will the company do in a rejected TA? Do their priorities change? Well, we know for a fact that the environment, this dynamic environment we have negotiated in, has changed dramatically under our feet. It's changed, it's 180 degrees out compared to where we started negotiation. We know that we started negotiations where the company couldn't hire enough pilots. They didn't have enough lift. They were wet leasing. So right now we have essentially a COVID-sized airline and staffing, but we're in a post-COVID era. In other words, our volumes have simply matched what we were in, and the trend is still negative on the volumes. Volumes are down 10%, 17% globally, freight volumes. So that obviously is a very large concern for us. But how does it impact the company when they come back to the table? Obviously, we would be coming back in with a different set of openers. Would those openers still be focused, or would it be much broader now? Would the company's openers still be focused, or would they have new items and new agenda? And we clearly believe the company would have new agenda items based off of Drive and Network 2.0. They have priorities, corporate-wide priorities, and FedEx Express is a large focus of some of those savings. So we understand and we believe strongly that the company would come back with a different set of priorities. So everything, when you look at rejecting a TA, has to be viewed in comparison to what's in the current language. Don't make the mistake and say you can compare a rejected TA into what we bargained, because nothing in what we bargained is guaranteed for the next time around. In other words, the retirement improvements that we fixed, the quality of life items that we made, the pay. None of those items are guaranteed in a follow-on TA. And we can look really at our nearest sample here, or nearest example, with United. And Rich talked about that a little bit. But the United example takes us back to November of 22 when they rescinded or rejected that TA. Now they've been in negotiations for 5 years. Fortunately, they just produced an AIP, but it's been after a 5-year duration. So are they going to be able to make up, or will we be able to make up the time value of money, and how long will it take? Will we look at a 5-year duration in negotiations? So let me finish on a more positive note. We obviously believe strongly in this TA. Your MEC believes strongly in this TA. 13 out of 14 reps who spent hundreds of hours behind the door with us receiving briefings on every section, in detailed briefings on the passes and on what the company's openers were. I can tell you this focused negotiation was successful. We ended up with a 4.5-year deal. The openers themselves, the battle plan was achieved in spite of the constantly shifting environment. So let's just compare the total cost of, say, our agreement compared to Delta. Delta's contract is valued at $23 billion. That's over 15,000 pilots. It's spread across 15,000 pilots. That's $1.5 million per pilot over 4 years. Now let's look at the FedEx contract. Our contract is now valued at $12.5 billion. $12.5 billion spread over 5,500 pilots. $2.24 million per pilot in value. That's a 44% premium. So the overall increase in value for this negotiation is $3.8 billion. Notably, $1.67 billion of that comes from the retirement, increased value in retirement. 44% of the increase in $2.14 billion in pay and fringe and other improvements. The structure. Lastly, you have to understand the structure. That retirement is compensation. It's just simply deferred compensation. Our structure is notably different. We put 30% in our pay at a minimum and 30% in our retirement. The Delta deal focused more on pay and work rules. Their deal put 34% into pay and fringe. Our deal, and their deal, put 12% in retirement. These are notable structural changes and differences. For that reason, we have the strongest, the most valuable deal of any ALPA contract in the past 20 years. We're proud of the deal. We think it deserves serious consideration. Before we break today, I want to let you know that we have other people that will join us for the Q&A. We'll have Art Luby with us, as well as Marty Harrington, the SIG PSIT chairman. If questions come up, we may ask them into the room, so you might see some chairs moving and some small adjustments there. As we move into the break, the video will display a login so that you can send your email questions in. We've already began receiving those questions, which we'll have pulled up on our computers. We'll discuss the questions internally, and we'll try and obviously have more of a roundtable discussion as we hit most of those questions. We will try to prioritize the questions in more of a theme-generated environment. In other words, If it comes in scope, we'll try to thematically answer the question. We'll be as specific as we can. Realize that many of the questions might have overlapping, and we're trying to get a good cross-section of those questions asked and answered. And we'll spend the time doing that. So you'll see here a 10-minute timer as we step out of the room for a quick break. Thanks for staying with us. Well, thanks and welcome back. Again, we're joined by Art Luby and Marty Harrington, our PSIT SIG chairman. We may ask them in and out during certain questions as we go through the question and answer period. I'll start off with the first question here. The question is there or are there any concerns that this TA will eventually add to the overstaffed issue with the operational efficiencies gained by the company because of 1, student lines, 2, 100% vacation buyback, and 3, voluntary vacation formula for min-bid period guarantee? Well, let's start off with the student lines. Student lines are, an answer is absolutely none. There's very few student lines that would create a problem here for us. In fact, if you look at some of the bid packs, which Rich spoke to, it's 40% of the non-pay only LCAs on any given month. So a bid pack, such as the size of Indianapolis or Oakland, that means about 1 line in each of those bid packs when training decides to use a line. Doesn't mean training will always grab a line. So in all other instances where pilots were ordinarily bumped off of those flights for training, that will still happen. So all the captains that get bumped for training, that always happens. So it's only the first officers. So it's very limited lines. Even in the very largest bid packs like Memphis, say the 767 or the 777, where there's over 400 lines in the first officers, you're only talking about 8 lines. So it's minimal, the amount of staffing adjustments there. Moving on to the second part of that is the 100% vacation buyback. Well, again, we don't see any impact at all. In fact, the costing numbers don't show any impact at all on the vacation buyback. What is really important here is that the pilots get to determine what's in their best interest for that vacation buyback. We've always seen the full usage of that buyback. We've also seen pilots that dip into next year's vacation accrual. In other words, they use every bit of it. We don't expect to see any change in behavior at all. Some pilots will still choose to sell back a lot of vacation or protect it, and maybe other years they use it all. So very minimal vacation buyback. And the last item there was the voluntary vacation formula and mid-bid period guarantee. Well, again, Rich spoke to this, and we see very little impact due to how pilots have historically used the voluntary vacation buyback. And Rich stated that 90% of the pilots were already flying at least min-bid period guarantee. And when you looked at the averages there, for a 4-week bid month, it was about 89 hours of actual flight hours flown. And for a 5-week bid month, pilots who sold back vacation typically flew about 109 hours on average. So we see very little staffing issues due to the items that we negotiated on the company with. We think the real staffing concern right now is that, again, the company hired all the way through the pandemic, and the volumes are now at pre-pandemic levels. So the second question, we'll move on, Rich, is going to be to you. The question is, do you still feel that new protections in scope language are enough and wet lease penalties significant enough to protect us given the recent announcement of the new CFO, which I think he means CEO?
I think he's talking about Mr. Dietrich, the new CFO.
Okay.
But thanks, Pat. So the premise of this question is actually the first thing I'd like to address. First of all, the addition of a CFO is not going to change the economics of wet leasing. Wet leasing is more expensive than using our own airplanes. It's 2 times as expensive. It's 15 to 20% less reliable. Nothing about one executive changes the math involved with wet leasing airplanes. It's more expensive. There's no reason that the company would want to use wet leasing instead of our pilots. So do I feel that the new protections and scope language are enough? Yes, they're better. They're better than what we have now. The penalties are not enough to prevent the company from actually wet leasing, if that's your worry. The restrictions that we've put in there now are real hard limits on what the company can do. So we've traded something that doesn't prevent the company from doing what you don't want for something that does. So do I feel the new protections are strong enough? Yes, they're stronger than what we have now. The whole premise that we have somehow made scope weaker is false. That's a false premise that I'm not even going to address here other than to say that it's false. The protections are better. It doesn't matter who the CFO is. That's basically what we had to say about it.
Yeah, and the CFO, just to give a little more background, our counterparts didn't know the announcement was going to be made, and that CFO position had to be filled by the company. In other words, the prior CFO, Michael Lenz, retired, And the FedEx board of directors was meeting in their annual meeting, and they had to place a new CFO. This CFO happens to have airline industry, goes back to 1999 with Atlas, and then United Airlines prior to that. So moving on to the next question. If the tentative agreement is not ratified, is it a quick process to define what scope protections we need and then be able to bargain for them? Well, first, let me just reflect for pilots who haven't been here or weren't here during 2006. The negotiating committee, through the MEC and the pilots, identified scope as an item that needed to be addressed or that should be addressed. It was a priority of theirs. Ultimately, they made a strong push to improve scope. What they ended up with were some improvements in scope, but they also had meaningful improvements given to or negotiated to the company's benefit as well. And one of those is domestic wet lease. So that, unfortunately, is going to be the issue when you open up scope to negotiate. The company will do what we did to them this time around. They opened scope, and we came back with a counter that included many items for negotiations. And the company pushed back on many of those items. And why did they push back when we try to go in and negotiate scope language? And it's simple. The company builds their corporation. They build Express through the scope language. It's very different than how passenger airlines treat their scope interest in their contracts. Our contract, the company uses scope as a shock absorber to capture new customers. They did this in 1999 when we got the postal, or 2001 when we got the postal agreement, and again we did it in 2020 when the pandemic hit. The company hired pilots during both of those periods of time. On the postal contract, it was over 1,000 pilots. During the pandemic, it was about 800 pilots as they were wet leasing. In other words, they hire pilots, grow the airline. They want to have purple pilots flying purple tails around the globe. It simply acts as their shock absorber. We obviously need to keep close eye on it. We need to see if it's a priority. But specifically to the question, there are a variety of parochial interests out there right now that have one thing in common. And the one thing in common is to defeat the TA. So those parochial interests are varied. Some pilots may have a strong desire to change scope. Some pilots may have a desire to perhaps increase a pay rate or a pay band. Some pilots might like to change some of the work rules or the reserve rules. But you could identify at least 4 different parochial interests. And the challenge here is on a failed TA, then how do you then bring these various parochial interests to a unified message and a unified theme? Because then those parochial interests actually have to get rectified into an actual unified goal, which is what we have here. We have a unified goal identified going back to 2016 and confirmed through our surveys in 2018. And the pilots had a singular goal, which was retirement improvements. So the MEC here would need to prioritize those disinterested groups into new targets, into new openers. That would take some time. That would take absolutely surveying the pilots and digging into what those interests are and reprioritizing in a way that now perhaps is directly in conflict with the pilots that wanted retirement improved as their number one issue. And it wasn't just 50% plus one that wanted their retirement. It was 87% of the pilots, survey after survey, as the number one issue. Those pilots do not vanish overnight. There would still be an absolute singular voice on retirement that would compete with those other interests. So Marty, I'm going to ask you in for this question, if you don't mind pulling up your chair here on the table, because this one will involve your answer, and we'll slide around for you. And as you're sliding up,
It's right here.
yeah. And so as Marty gets situated, I'll actually start in on the question. The question is, why have we heard nothing, Marty, from the company regarding our manning situation? And what I would say is we actually heard plenty from the company from our perspective. And it confirms the overstaffing, both at the negotiating table and in your subject matter expertise in your area through the scheduling committee. You also understood and heard loud and clear from the company about the manning situation. In fact, you have specific data points that you can probably summarize for the pilot. You want to step through that a little bit with us?
Right, and thanks. I thought you were going to keep me off camera, but now that I'm here, we probably over the past 2 weeks or so, we've had a lot of questions just in what we do on a month-to-month. Piece it in the SIG, we have over 40 volunteers. We're in with the corporation every single month. We review every pairing. We build the lines. We have feedback for the pairings and how those building the lines towards targets that the company requests we build the lines to.
Yeah.
We've been annotating the SIG notes, which we publish every single month. That decline in BLGs, buy-ups are being utilized, and that trend has gotten worse probably since right after peak of this year. We meet with management on their side. We have a SIG quarterly that has discussing staffing, system bids, aircraft acquisitions, charters, and we get a number of data points from the company every single month. Paul Hansen's our knowledge manager, and in 25BB it outlines all the data that we get. We get sick time, draft volunteer, credit, block, and we track all those, and we track them on a month-to-month basis going back 20 years. So we knew the situation in staffing was getting more and more difficult. I have briefed the MEC and the reps every single month on the trends that have happened over the past year. So it was not news to us. My comm I put out last weekend discussed. I've been discussing it every single month in the SIG notes that the trend has been going down.
And we'll show while you're talking, Marty, what I'll ask them to do is show slide number 81, because I think that's the slide that you guys produced in your committee, and you've produced it on your SIG notes as well for the
Right.
pilots to view. So this was
Yeah.
not internal from us. This was a product you guys do.
Yeah, Paul Hansen put it together. I briefed the MEC on this back in April, and it had the same line without the noted reduced min BLG. And I pointed up to it and said, okay, does anyone know what this was? And it's like, yeah, that was 42B back in 2009. And you can see when I saw that line trending below the same numbers we had back in 2009, with the amount of buy-up being utilized on a month-to-month, it's pretty clear where we're going. We need something to change. We either need more freight to ship or less pilots, one or the other. 42B is likely in our near future. And I don't know, 42C may be a number of months out, maybe possibly next year, but again, it's all speculation, depends on the economy, where we go, and if we can get some pilots to retire in the near term.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. And brings up some good points. So clearly the company's been doing some things just synthetically, building up lines, bringing basically adding free hours in to the
We
pilots,
have been,
right?
in 42B, it's pretty much a circuit breaker that says they have to do X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm.
We've already cut carry-out domestically almost down to nothing. That's one of the things we do. There is still some international carry-out. The 777 still has higher BLG averages, but I would expect those cuts to be made as well.
Yeah.
Trip trading and other limitations in 42B haven't been implemented yet, but I think those will be implemented in the near future as well.
Yeah, and there's some, some green shoots out there in the economy that, as we've been briefed by Liz Spear, there's some green shoots as far as shipping and potential turnaround in volumes, but right now we're not seeing that yet
I hope
materialize.
so, Pat. I always try to deal with the worst case scenario, and yeah, we're dealing with. I haven't seen. I don't know where the plateau is, but I don't think we've hit it yet.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Marty. I appreciate it.
Yep.
So, Rich, the next question here for you is regarding Section 1, in a percentage value, approximately how much is wet lease payment, I guess our wet lease payments reduced as compared to the current language?
Thanks, Pat. So this is a difficult question to answer in the way that it's posed. The percentage value reduction is different depending on how the wet leasing is done. Obviously, the amount of free wet leasing is greater under the TA than it is under the current TA. So small amounts of wet leasing, the percentage is much less. The more we wet lease, the less the difference becomes, because the SPR is actually higher than in most cases, higher than the credit hour value for an average crew. We've discussed in the past how it would depend on which trips they decided to use, but the odds are that in order to efficiently use the wet leasing, it would probably be hard time trips, so your credit hours and block hours would be close to the same, and then that SPR would be much more. So that would drive the difference down and the percentage down. But the short answer is that in most cases it will be less. The truth of that, though, is that it doesn't really matter because the percentage of the entire wet lease cost that's covered in the penalty is like a sales tax. It's basically a sales tax on the wet lease for the company. So is it less? Yes. But the whole sales tax or half the sales tax or 2/3 of the sales tax is not going to prevent the company from making that wet lease. It's just an additional cost. The company wanted to reduce their costs in this because they knew they were going to spend on retirement and pay. So they wanted to reduce their costs wherever they were or wherever they could find. And this was one place that they targeted, that they said, we use this for good purposes. As Pat discussed earlier, this is how they grow the business. So we would like to pay less in this area. And we agreed because we put in protections in Section 1 that are real limits. So the real limits are much more important than this penalty. We can't seem to get this across to people, but the penalty itself is no more than a sales tax on the actual cost of the wet lease. It's not a deterrent for the company. It's an annoyance. That is not going to prevent them from wet leasing. What really prevents them from wet leasing is the protections that we put in, and we put them in at a certain place at 482C because that's where they're valuable to us. Because if we're not in that situation and we're growing, then we want them to do that wet leasing and grab that business. That's what they've always done. That's how their business plan works. They do belly freight till they get enough to get a wet lease. Then they do the wet lease until they have enough for one of our airplanes to fly that freight. And they bring business to us and bring flying to us by utilizing this wet leasing.
Okay, thanks, Rich. I appreciate it. The question here is, why was international override not increased in this TA? This one's simple. It's already the highest in the industry by a far margin. This was a focused negotiation, and the MEC and the pilots, through surveys, they didn't believe this was identified. It was not identified as an item that needed significant time and resources to address. Remember, there were other even higher priority items that didn't make it into this round of negotiation, like Section 11 pilots overrides. Next question was on the last Q&A. It was mentioned there would be a writing committee regarding some language. Why is that? This came up actually, we've had a couple of questions that have come up or raised during the roadshow that at that time we couldn't answer those immediately. In fact, we needed to have more research, and we needed to have an internal discussion about clarifying and potentially answering those two questions. Those two items were specifically SMU, or the student makeup lines, and that was versus disruption pay. And the SMU versus disruption pay was clarified. And the next thing was the temporary mill leave in the month and how that interacted with the earned credit hours. And the earned credit hours we did discuss internally, and the company confirmed our view on that, which is, in fact, when a pilot drops temporary mill leave orders, that those hours also account for their earned credit hours. So we're happy to clarify that. And look, I mean, this is going to happen when you have newly bargained language, and there were great questions that came up. Happy the pilots asked them, and we got those clarifications. We'll be sending out communications that state just that to the pilots sometime in the next day or two.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, Pat, that it's a great way to put it. It's a clarification of what we have bargained with the company. It's not a side letter or a secret agreement or a secret written thing on the side. It's just a clarification of what was bargained with the company and how that's actually going to work going forward.
Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Art to come in to the table and sit at the corner. We'll slide around, give Art some room here. But we've got basically this first question. I'll probably hand it off to Rich and Art. Art, we can start with you, and then we'll take a couple here that we have lined up for Art. But the first question here, Art, is why has the ASL flying not been removed and replaced by purple tails in Europe, leaving them only on the routes we legally cannot fly?
I'm not aware right now of any flights or any segments that are done by ASL that we can legally or by European regulation fly.
Okay.
And Rich, you may want to add to that.
So ASL was a special circumstance for the company, and it all goes back to the TNT purchase. When we purchased TNT, we were unable by European Union laws to own that part of the TNT airline. Now we took their 777s and put those into our fleet. And as a matter of fact, our MEC chair went over to Liège and got yelled at by one of the union leaders from Belgium about us taking their jobs because we took those 777s and put them into our fleet. So that was a big issue over there, is maintaining these jobs. And part of the sale of the TNT airline to ASL was this amount of flying that they have. And you can see that was part of that contract. So the flying that ASL is doing is not increasing. It's basically flat because it's part of that deal. That's why FedEx is still doing it, because they have to be doing it. So this wasn't something that they came into and said, hey, we want extra flying over here, so we're going to go contract out with ASL. It was ASL is going to buy this airline and we're going to give them this flying.
Yeah.
And if you look at our flying in Europe over the same time period, our flying has actually grown in Europe.
So Art, the next one is to you. It says, if the TA fails, why wouldn't the MEC chair direct that we ask to be released from mediation? Is there any legal reason we would not be able to do this?
Well, under ALPA policy, the MEC chair must ask the ALPA president to file a request for a proffer of arbitration and a release from the National Mediation Board. The NMB is not required to and usually does not issue a proffer, and if the proffer is rejected, a release for self-help simply because a tentative agreement is rejected. The decision on release of the parties to engage in self-help is wholly within the discretion of the NMB and is only made when the NMB makes a judgment that both sides have made every reasonable effort to make and maintain agreements and that further mediation would not be useful. Under that criteria, a decision to release the parties into self-help is uncommon, and in fact, the last NMB release of a pilot group to strike was in 2010 at Spirit Airlines, which occurred more than 3 years after the amendable date of the pilot agreement and after more than 2 years of mediated bargaining for an amended agreement under circumstances in which the carrier was still demanding cost savings in the aggregate. The Spirit strike was not stopped by the appointment of a presidential emergency board. I can't say whether in the event the NMB ever issued a proffer and release at FedEx, a PEB would be impaneled. However, I can say that a strike at FedEx would have more impact on the American economy than the strike at Spirit in 2010, and we would be more exposed to the possibility of a PEB in the event we were released to strike. The bottom line of all this is that if a tentative agreement is rejected, it is unlikely that the NMB will issue a proffer of binding arbitration or release at any time in the foreseeable future. And I would add to that, there is a pending request for a release by the Southwest pilots. That has not been acted on, but I do not anticipate it being approved.
Okay, thanks, Art. And the next question here is, I think there's some hyperbole or maybe some conjecture about what could happen. If the TA fails, can the company come right back to the negotiating committee with everything the same, and this is in quotes, everything the same except double the amendable date recovery payment and 10% increase in pay rates?
If the agreement is rejected, we could come back and demand anything we want, just as the company can come back and demand anything that they want. Both sides, all bets are off at that point. And both sides can start from ground zero. That is not likely to result in a quick agreement, and it certainly will. It certainly will not encourage the NMB to set an aggressive negotiating schedule.
Yeah.
At that point, we would be regarded as being outside, in all likelihood, the zone of reasonableness, which is the area in which you have to be in to have credibility with the NMB.
Yeah, we're certainly, pilots compared, some pilots that have come here from perhaps their regional backgrounds, maybe some other union affiliation and rejected TAs. But here's one thing we know for sure. This team, we've been negotiating with this company for 7 years. We know our counterparts. We know how they bargain. We know their manners. We know how they make proposals, and we know their seriousness. We also know when they're making proposals just in the sake of proposal language. What we know what we are certain of is that we negotiated the very best deal. The company believes they've done that. In fact, they've said numerous times, obviously, that they feel they've gone beyond what the expectation was here, certainly on the pay rates. So I don't view them, and we have 18 MOUs that we negotiated with this company, OIMs or LOAs, since we've taken over the negotiating committee. And each one of those has been an improvement in some regard, whether it be pay or benefits or protections during COVID. So we know when we're getting to the point at where we've reached the end of our rope on certain language. And I can tell you, the company, what their reaction certainly will be is not to just find a new agreement in the top drawer and slide it over the table. It comes out of, and I understand why pilots might want to believe that, but with our experience, I can tell you from our experience in negotiating with this company, that's not going to be the case. So anybody that believes that today, it's speaking out of maybe wishful thinking, and it's a dangerous and slippery slope that they should not go down.
Well, I would add one other point. At the conclusion of mediated negotiations back in June, we prevailed upon the mediator to pressure the company to come up with what he believed and what we believe was their true bottom line. He respected our wishes on that. He put a lot of work and effort into it. And I'm not saying that people then have to accept that, but on the other hand, it is not going to be, we are not going to get a lot of assistance from the NMB, at least at the outset, for trying to add to a package that they believe they did everything possible to help us achieve.
Yeah, and that leads to probably the last question here, Art, for you, is that if we sought to reopen this agreement based on the UAL agreement in principle, would the NMB view it as regressive bargaining?
Regressive bargaining or the NMV views regressive bargaining as making a tentative agreement and then demanding something more, and views that kind of conduct as bad faith bargaining. Sometimes an unanticipated industry development can be a justification for regressive bargaining, but the UAL agreement, which was consistent with and based directly on the Delta pattern, was not surprising or unanticipated. More important, the incremental costs of our agreement per pilot are still substantially higher than the UAL agreement, primarily because of the far greater costs of our retirement. Under these circumstances, I think the NMB would view backing away from our TA on the basis of the United AIP as regressive bargaining.
Okay, thank you, Art, I appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right, Mike, I'm just looking down the list. Next one's coming to you. Here it is. It says, I understand a third party invests the market-based cash balance plan money based on rough guidelines in 28C11, and the question emphasizes or shows the 55% stock, 45% bonds. But who gives more specific direction with respect to the risk versus return on those investments? That's the first question. And it would be in the company's, I guess a statement here, it would be in the company's best interest to invest as conservatively as possible, earning us very low returns. Are they the ones who direct the investment, or does the third party act independently? So it's a great question.
It is a
one
great
you can
question,
unpack.
Pat. Glad to address it. So the company does and will engage third-party investment managers to manage this portfolio, as they do now with the pension plan. However, the company is and will remain the plan fiduciary. We are not exporting this out to a third party. And as Art has articulated at the roadshows, plan fiduciaries have a very important role in plan administration. They have obligations under the law, and they have liabilities under the law. FedEx has in the past shown they take these fiduciary obligations very seriously, and we expect them to continue to do so. So those guidelines that the question asks, I would perhaps disagree that they're rough guidelines. They are actually binding on the company unless the parties otherwise agree to modify them, and that may happen. There's a lot of uncertainties in investments, and it's not a suicide pact. We want to give the company latitude where it's warranted. But they're also binding on the investment policy statement, which is used to inform these investment managers. So the investment policy statement, when that is developed, we'll be looking to that 28C11 provision as it's constructed. So and one last thing, the portfolio mentioned in the question, Pat, that's a benchmark for volatility itself, and it's not the actual asset allocation. You've got to read that a little bit carefully to pick that out of there. It is a little bit wonky. But the reason that we negotiated this 28C11 provision was very important to us during negotiations, as you recall, was to address the very concern raised in the question, and that was that the company perhaps may only be looking at low returns to cover their floor benefit guarantee, and we wanted to make sure there was adequate risk and volatility placed into the plan to get returns to make this plan warranted for our membership. But the investment managers do not act independently of the company, the CBA, or the investment policy statement.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Appreciate unpacking that for us. The next question has to do with the max final average earnings cap. Actually is, I'll correct that, it is $260,000 in the 1999 contract. It still is that today. The inflation since then shows that we should have a final average earnings cap of $474,000 just to match inflation. Please speak to why the 338 was the best you can do. Well, let me back up a little bit on this one. We've clearly identified that high five final average earnings cap as being the limiting factor in what needed to change. But it also, this question kind of presumes that everything else was essentially set in 99 and there was no other growth available in that. And we know, though, from our pay rates that in 1999, we weren't yet at that $260,000 final average earnings. In fact, we were well below it. So there was room to grow into that higher 260 FAE. And we essentially went from 1999, if you looked at the pay rate, and if you simply multiply our pay rate by 1,000 hours, that we actually weren't able to achieve that 260 FAE on a pay rate basis until about 2012. So that's really, we grew into that plan. There was never an expectation or a promise ever to increase the pension from that point in time due to inflation. That was never anybody's identified item. The other thing I'll also say is that it wasn't a pension alone for our pilots. We also have, in addition to the pension, we have the defined contribution, now the PRSP, that was set up, and it was in a way to move from the profit sharing that was established, and then it newly established was the defined contribution company money to our PRSP. Back in 99, it was 6%. So that 6% also has grown since 1999. So that hasn't remained static either. It had an increase in 2006 by 1%. They increased from 6 to 7, and then the 2015 negotiation, again, that increases from the 7 up to the current 9%. And it's done it over a series of years. What also has to be included in the discussion here with regard to inflationary pressures on that FAE cap are the pay service multipliers. And those were also negotiated effectively and put in the contract both in 1999 and 2006 to offset those DC increases. So big picture wise, just to come in and state that the company should increase the pension based off a pure inflation number is a fallacy. Nobody ever had that expectation, nor was it ever promised to the pilots. But what we did do is we did look at obviously inflation adjustments from essentially 2012 forward to see kind of what ballpark. We negotiated, or we actually proposed a much higher FAE cap, and ultimately what happens through negotiations, you get to the agreed terms, and we did significantly improve for the first time in our history a permanent fix to the legacy pension of the 338 cap. So that's kind of how it worked.
Hey, Pat,
Yeah.
if I could jump in real quick and
Yeah.
make one quick correction to previous answer when we were talking about ASL.
Okay.
We recognize that some of that ASL flying or that ASL flying is not legally flying that we can't do, but it is, we can't legally enforce any of our contract on any of that flying since it's extraterritorial. And it is still part of that contract that FedEx signed when they sold TNT to ASL. So we understand the operations around ASL, but it's not something that we can actually address within our contract, and it's not something that is new for the company, and all of that flying that they're doing is part of a previous agreement. So just want to make sure that that's the message everybody takes away from the ASL discussion.
That's fair. Thanks, Rich, for the clarification there.
One
Mike,
other
and you had
thing
something
on the pension, Pat, for people that, and we agree, we would love to have seen that pension cap up to 600,000. It's a nice, comfortable place to be. But what people have to understand about changing pension benefits versus changing defined contribution or even the market-based cash balance plan, the new plan that we have, Pat, is that we'll start with the new plans. With the new plans, when you make a change, those changes take place prospectively. You keep what you had in the past, and the cost is just going forward, an ongoing cost, like a service cost, if you will, with the pension. When you change a pension plan, it's not just prospective, but it's regressive as well, so that you have a prospective version of this that you have to cover. It's sort of like a retro pay due to the plan, and you have to cover all the years prior as well as going forward in order to get the money right. And the older that the participants are, the more that has to be put into the plan in order to cover those obligations. And I think in our case, even at $338,000 of benefit, or I'm sorry, $33,000 of cap, we were close to $1 billion just in that alone.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And that's been the challenge. That's been the challenge and why it's been so hard for us ever to have a permanent improvement to the pension, which obviously we overcame this time around through our unique approach that we took into this on this negotiation.
That's right.
The next question, Mike, again, back to you. So I've heard several times in the roadshow in this Q&A that the normal retirement age is 62. I thought we can receive maximum 50% pension at age 60. Has this changed in the current contract?
Yeah, this remains to be sort of a confusing issue, and I'll just tee it up a little bit, is that the initial retirement age under the plan, and that was actually, they just made it true for everyone at the company, and it was age 60, but that was tagged to us because we were federally mandated to retire by age 60, so they just used age 60 as the normal retirement in the pension. However, with the mandatory retirement age change to 65, we really couldn't get away with that any longer. And it was really a government mandated change to use 62, and it's a safe harbor age, which means that you use it and the IRS doesn't ask any questions on why you did. So, but with that, we didn't want to change how we operated the pension. So actually, still to this day, early retirement reductions in the plan do not begin until you're prior to age 60. So we haven't changed operationally how it runs, but officially the normal retirement age is 62, but we have a contractual fix.
Yeah, so simple answer to the pilot's question, assuming he has a 50%.
No change.
No change. He's good to go at 60, and if he wants to go before 60 and he's still in the pension, you mentioned he's got a reduction. Right. Thanks. All right. So the next question for me, I guess, is could the legacy A plan be enhanced in later negotiations? So the question is yes, quite simply, it could be. What we've done in this negotiation is we've understood that it's important to keep pilots across all of these plans connected, and we've connected them through the defined contribution, keeping that consistent. So whether you're off on the legacy pension or you're in the market-based plan and you've got a partial foot in the pension with the transition, or as a new hire, you're only in the market-based plan, we're all connected through that 9% DC. So that's the first, easiest, low-hanging fruit that's out there. And I think that clearly will be, a target for future negotiations. But to answer the specific question, like I said, yes, it can be enhanced. We have, and we just discussed here earlier, 2 ways that we've been successful at improving the pension for a segmented group or a targeted group. When you make a DC improvement, they've made pay service multiplier increases, and that's been successful. There's no reason why, if that were the target for the pilots in future negotiations with the MEC, the negotiating committee, that's what they can do. Here's another one, Mike. We've heard this question. I think it's arisen out there a little bit in social media, and I think we actually put out a pretty long article that deals with this issue in particular with the help of Kathy Powers, our ERISA attorney.
Direct the members' attention to that article if they have questions regarding this. You bet. It was very well done.
Yeah, okay. And that's the question, is could the Legacy A plan be dissolved in later negotiations?
Yeah, dissolved is funny for those of us that work in this arena quite a bit, because there's various ways to terminate a plan, and I've dissolved is usually not one of them that come to mind, but I understand the point here. First thing, especially for people that are sort of new to the property, this plan that we're in, the legacy pension plan, is not a pilot-only plan. There are numerous employees of the company still receiving benefits or will receive benefits out of this plan. So the pilot-only portion of it could be terminated in the future, but again, only for pilots only, if there was a joint agreement between the company and the association to do so. However, people need to understand, though, the current benefit accruals that you have to date are protected, and they cannot be reduced by plan amendments. So we could freeze the plan perhaps, but we couldn't dissolve it, make it go away such that benefits would be affected by that plan amendment. So the plan would have to continue until all benefit obligations are satisfied, and that again, a termination like this is not a cheap thing for a company to do. It's costly because of the assumptions that are used in these termination scenarios. And I guess the point of the question would be, could people in the plan prospectively go to something else?
Excuse me.
And if there was something more beneficial that we wanted to put the pilots in and the pilots agreed to it, it's, again, this is not a suicide pact, that such a thing could theoretically be done.
Okay, thanks, Mike. The next one is, could the market, it's much like the previous one I answered, but could the market-based cash balance plan be enhanced in later negotiations? The answer is yes. Again, driven by the pilot's desires, and through pattern bargaining, we're always looking at improvements in pay and retirement benefits, and notably here, and what's different from the current pension is it's far easier to make improvements in the market-based cash balance plan, unlike the current pension plan, because it doesn't carry all those other obligations that hit the company's balance sheet, that hit their debt load, things like the projected benefit obligation. It's very much a here-forward fix, unlike the legacy pension plan that you mentioned, Mike. It was retrospective and prospective fix. That's why that's been such an albatross to improve. But the new market-based cash balance plan, we've set up a durable plan. It grows with our income because the IRS interest, or the IRS max compensation rates, should continue to increase with inflation. So it's a durable plan for that reason, but it's also easier to negotiate improvements in that plan going forward. If someone, Mike, this is you, if someone with less than 5 years of service switches to the market-based cash balance plan, are those years lost in future retirement earnings? Example, 3 years of service would be 6 years of those towards the pension. Is 5 years required?
Yeah, and this is a simple, but it's really an important question, and it's really something that those that are thinking of transitioning to the market-based plan really should have a good grasp of, because I certainly wouldn't want someone to shy away from perhaps transitioning over with the thought that the conception that they might lose the years of service that they had because they didn't have 5 in. So I would direct their attention over to the implementation LOA, and the implementation LOA makes it very clear that if you do not have full vesting credit into the pension plan and you transition to the market-based plan, that you'll continue to accrue those vesting years while you're in the market-based plan, so you will get credit for every year of service that you have in it when you transition.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Rich, question is, what's to stop the company from making hotel standby trips that perfectly fit every block of R16 for the next month during the SWW and pre-assigning them before open time releases, thus not letting the pilots drop their R16 and making them sit hotel standby? And if you want to have Marty join in at all, if he has an opinion on that, but you want to take the first stab, or?
Sure, I can take the first stab at it. The first thing is that all known hotel standbys have to be in the bid pack. So the first step in that would be the company would have to justify to the SIG why they needed all these hotel standbys that magically match up with all of the R16 blocks. That's going to be a pretty high hurdle to begin with, and that's a thing that we can hold them to and prevent them from doing it that way. The next part of this is that pre-assigning them before open time opens. 25G1 talks about the fact that they can use open time at any time for certain things, but assignment of R16, R24 is not one of those things. And then it goes on to say that the first 12 hours after open time is open is specific to the pilots. So our interpretation of that would be that they couldn't do that after the secondary working window closes, that those trips that are still in open time have to be available to the pilots first before the company can use them. The other part of this is in 25 M3E. And that says that if you assign an R16 to a trip, then they have to be released until the beginning of that trip. So they would only be able to assign them to the one that's closest, the first one, because if they assign one to further than that, then the contract would say that they'd have to be released up until that contract, or up until that assignment. So there's several areas in here that would prevent the company from flooding the zone, so to speak, with base hotel standbys.
All right, Marty, you can swing in around the table here with us.
So, Rich, in the new TA, didn't you change the definition of base hotel standby to it pays actually TAFB?
That's right.
Which would actually cost the company more to put that guy in a hotel now.
That's right.
Again, we track all the pairings. We notice all these pairings get flooded into perfectly match that. We would say, why are we doing this? What was the plan here? And then current SLG software limitations would not allow that. You have to port those pairings in during their snapshot, which takes place a day before the secondary working window opens. Yeah, there's just, I can't see any benefit to the company for doing something along those lines, so.
Okay, thank you, Marty. Thanks, Rich. A question, I'll take this one. It says, why have you put out communication letting people know that they can change their vote? So look, we've had a lot of queries about whether a vote cast can be changed. We want you to know your rights as you work through the information that we provided. It's really just that simple. There are different obligations depending on the type of ballot that's open under the ALPA Constitution and bylaws, and we simply want the pilots to know what their rights are. Mike, this one's to you. I'm a fairly new pilot and have been at the company for just over 2 years. Since I'm not currently vested in the pension, does this make me a participant or non-participant?
Yeah, there's an opportunity to unpack a few things here, Pat, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
The distinction between a participant or non-participant for our purposes with the transition, and then whether or not someone is a participant and why does it matter. So a person is considered a participant in the pension plan if they have 1,000 hours accredited service. And we've had that question before. I'll just briefly review it. There's been some concern, well, wait a minute, I don't even fly 1,000 hours in a year. Have I ever even been, credited? And of course that answer is no, because, as we've stated at the roadshows, that two things need to happen to get credited service under the plan, and one is that you have to be actively employed, and two, you have to be able to fog a mirror. If you can successfully do both of those things, you will get awarded 95 hours per pay period as an IRS equivalency. That's 190 a month, so it takes about 5.5 months to get that 1,000 hours. You'll probably never even have known it happened. So those that have 1,000 hours and have a year of service considered in the plan would be considered participants. Those that do not have 1,000 hours as of July 31st will not be participants going into the plan. Okay, so now we've established who's a participant, who isn't. Since you can see this person says, well, I've been here a couple of years now, so we would certainly consider this person to be a participant. But if you were not, the distinction is, one, where is the default? If I don't make an election, which way do I go? Well, non-participants, their default will be into the market-based plan. Participants will default into the pension plan. There's one other thing that is distinctive to non-participants, and that is you have a choice to make still. A non-participant will have the opportunity to make an election even though the default is to the market-based plan, and that is how they'll be treated either way. So real brief, if you just select to go to the market-based plan, you will actually have a beginning credit balance awarded to you for your time since the time you got hired of compensation credits that you will take with you when you enter the plan, because we don't want you not to have a crediting award for your time here while the company gets this plan in place, and they thought that was a good idea as well. If you elect to go to the pension plan, then you will not get those interest credits, obviously, because you won't need them, but you will then be treated as if you were entering the pension normally, and you would get your service credit hours as if the marketplace plan never existed. So you got two roads. You're not going to get both.
Yeah, and that actually leads into the next question as well. And it said, why didn't we advocate to keep new hires in the A plan? And so the preposition is wrong here, that we didn't advocate. In fact, that very issue,
Yes.
which the company wanted to do the opposite, the company wanted to treat the non-participants and give them no choice.
That's right.
And we knew from our own experience, I mean, I personally came here because of the pension in 1999. And I did not want to advocate or at least let go of this idea that a pilot could have made that decision to come to FedEx based off the pension, and then remove that opportunity away from them. Now, in most cases, we know that the market-based cash balance plan for the younger new hires, this thing is far
That's
more
right.
valuable than the improved pension. But to be clear, we advocated strongly to keep those new hires in the plan. We didn't remove it. We just gave them the option to stay in the plan. They just have to elect to stay in that plan.
That's exactly right.
So we fought for and won that battle. And I think perhaps maybe the pilot could also be asking this question, what about pilots that aren't yet hired? So they're not new hires, they're just not yet hired. Those pilots will enter directly into the market-based cash balance plan. And again, the reason for the diversion here was important to the results we produce, right? We recognize, because we fought and have seen numerous bargaining cycles where we couldn't overcome the pushback from the company and improve the pension. So what we didn't want to do was saddle future negotiations, future generations of pilots with the same thing, the same albatross we just knocked down, right? We put them in a much better position, the new hires in a much better position to actually be successful in retirement negotiation without exercising all the leverage that it took in this bargaining cycle.
So it is a new design. It's going to take some getting used to. It's going to have to prove itself. We understood all that, and we still
And it's a
understand
pension.
that. And it's a pension.
Yeah.
But it is a much more durable and easily manageable plan than our legacy plan, no question about it.
Yep, thanks. Mike, who manages the current legacy pension and who will manage the market-based cash balance plan? Why do you think the 6.5% target rate is realistic?
Who manages the pension is the company. This is part of their fiduciary obligation. They do have a third party, a light, that does a lot of the administrative work for them. They have investment managers whose names I do not know, but I guess if the broad answer would be that the company does manage the legacy pension, and it will be basically those same people who have managed the legacy pension that will be managing the market-based cash balance plan. The 6.5% target rate, if it's a great opportunity to unpack this a little bit for the membership that's listening. That target rate was developed so that we could model our proposals and the company's proposals. And it was a number that we could defend and validate with regard to the portfolio design and what we put in 28C11. So it made sense to use this number initially. But it may be a number, given the returns on the plan, that in any given period, you may never see 6.5%. It's a long-term projection of what that return would be, and it is the outgrowth of 28C11 and how we're structuring that portfolio as a very low volatility, modest return type of investment design. The company has come out and said, actually, we like this even better than we initially thought, and we will now say that over the next 20 years, that portfolio design really should produce 7 to 7.2%, and they put that in writing to us.
Yeah, they had to give us those projections. That was part of the negotiation.
That's correct.
Was to give us those projections. I know we're about to lose Art. He has to travel back to Washington, D.C. Art, I want to thank you for the time that you came in and spent with us and on the road shows and everything else you've done to help us during the end game negotiations.
Did you want me to comment on
Sure. Yeah, you absolutely can.
Yeah, let me just add this to what Mike just said. It's our responsibility as a union to monitor the performance and the handling of our funds. And if we find that there's been self-dealing or negligence, then we have a recourse, which is to bring litigation. And that has been done before, and obviously we understand the importance of making sure that these funds are handled correctly.
Thanks, Art. And you know, from historical perspective, we do have lots of areas that we end up in grievances, or we have cases and settlements and arbitrations with the company, but typically retirement benefits is not one of those. Those are relatively ironclad. They're built, designed by ERISA attorneys, and both teams go back and forth because it's not just what's in the CBA. There's also an underlying plan document that's been very well vetted and worked through. So I don't think we've ever had an arbitration over the company's contribution to a pilot's DC or the calculation of their pension benefit, as far as I know. But you know, so we're in solid footing here. One of the last questions, we'll try and wrap it up here, Mike. The market-based cash balance plan, and this one's a little bit in the weeds, but how does it work if a pilot is on LTD? And I think important in that is it is covered, right? We negotiated an LTD
First things
benefit.
first, it is
Yeah,
covered.
yeah.
Yeah, we did think through that. It was one of the last things that we negotiated into the structure. And for anybody following along with the TA, that would be part of C7D. And it's a bit cryptic. So you'll see numbers in here. You know, we have two benefits. We have the 60% benefit that goes for 2 years, then a 50% benefit for the remaining of your LTD. And so for the 60% benefit, the number comes in at 15.6% of your benefit, of the actual LTD benefit. And then when it transitions over to 50%, it goes to 18.7% of your benefit. And I can see people going, how'd you guys ever come up with those numbers? Well, what we did not want to happen was that the benefit be 11% of LTD, which is where the company wanted to start from. So what we did was we said, okay, let's look back to the actual earnings that produced the LTD benefit, that highest 12 of 36. And that was where the fight was. We fought the company up to 85% of that number. And if you were to take 85% of the highest 12 of last 36 for your LTD, then you would come up with your 15.6 and 18.7 number. So that's the history behind where those came from, Pat.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. So just some final thoughts as we close out here today with the pilots. First of all, thanks for the pilots and any of the spouses that may have joined us online. I appreciate Art and Marty's expertise coming in to help us on the Q&A. You know, this is the fourth event just this week alone with our pilots directly, either virtually or in person. We have one more event tomorrow at the Memphis AOC right before the three of us get on a jump seat and get to go home. You know, look, this has been obviously a stressful time, but we also know that it's been worth every ounce of effort, blood, sweat, and tears that we put into this TA negotiation. And it wasn't just this team. It was the entire larger team with the capital T, all of the staff members, everybody that's supported us and helped us along the way, and the MEC, the leadership involvement. So we absolutely appreciate that level of support that we got. It produced the most valuable contract that's ever been in front of the FedEx pilots. And it's up to the pilots now at this point. Ultimately, up to the pilots to go out there and take the win. It's in your hands. You just have to take the win and bring it to the bank and put the checkbook away. Let FedEx pay for this one. Last thing we want to do is give FedEx the opportunity to take this $3.8 billion contract and go preserve it for their initiatives and drive a network 2.0. They have other means to capture that savings. There's a lot of senior executives spending an awful lot of time doing just that. And we hope for all of our benefit that the company's successful in improving the balance sheet and that we can all enjoy a long career here. But in the meantime, let's take the win and put this one in the bank for the pilots, for all of us, for our future. So I appreciate everybody spending the time with us this afternoon and look forward to getting the results on Monday. Thank you.